We are live. Mr. Belsky, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Oh, absolutely. Um, well, thank you for coming. Today, we are with Mr. Gerald Belsky of the Schiller Institute, who has been with the LaRouche organization since 1972. Um, we are going to talk about BRICS, the Schiller Institute, what they think about BRICS and how it relates to Africa, a little bit of history. Before we do that, I'd like to say thank you to Mr. Belsky for coming, and also would like to remind the listeners to subscribe to Nefasit Post and to this YouTube channel. And also, I will put a link in there for you to be able to follow all my work and the current developments that are taking place, so you can follow my articles and things like that. Without further ado, Mr. Belsky, thank you for coming. Could you please tell us a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself, and in the Schiller Institute?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Emmanuel. Yes, the Schiller Institute was founded back actually in 1984 by Helga Zepp LaRouche, who is the wife of the late economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche. And it's sort of an outgrowth of the overall LaRouche movement. But it was specifically formed around the concept that we had to create a new, just economic order. And at the same time, we had to get a dialogue of cultures, because the basic idea of the Schiller Institute is that human creativity is the key to the economy. And therefore, a dialogue of cultures based on that human creativity is the key to organizing to make that new economic order function. Um, and the idea of the Schiller Institute, that it goes back to the famous poet and historian Friedrich Schiller, who was the inspiration for Beethoven in the Ninth Symphony. But his basic idea at the time of the American Revolution is that a political revolution by itself is not enough. You have to change the culture to develop people who can basically run society. So the Schiller Institute was founded essentially in the 80s to promote the idea of a just new order. And we based the principles of the Schiller Institute actually on the Declaration of Independence. We just took a few words out that referred specifically to the British. And if you just change a few words, essentially we indicted the IMF at the time as doing what the British Empire was doing. It's really a continuation of the same imperial policy. So the idea of the Schiller Institute was that we had to pull together countries all over the world to create a new economic order based on the idea that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that means restructure the financial system to make that possible.
So, you and I have spoken about the Heartland theory and how it impacted post World War II politics. And we also spoke about Franklin Delano Roosevelt's ideas of a post war era that was meant to be inclusive. And I think it would be very helpful if you can talk about the Heartland theory, what it means, and later on maybe inject about how it impacted the world order that we are in today.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, after you had discussed this with me, this is the theory of Halford Mackinder, the British geopolitician and spokesman for the British Empire in the 1904 period. But I went back and looked at what Lyndon LaRouche himself said about this Mackinder theory. And he said that this guy Mackinder was basically a nut who come up with this geographical cover story. The idea that you have to control the heartland in order to control the world island, in order to control the world. This was a cover story for the British Empire trying to crush any nation that wanted to implement what was called the American system. And there's a little history to this. Let me just go back, because this is not what's well understood about Mackinder's theory. He was putting forward a cover story for the British Empire, which was terrified at the beginning of the 20th century that the ideas of the American system, which had been developed by Alexander Hamilton, continued through Henry Carey and Abraham Lincoln, which was the concept that you use government credit to build manufacturing and infrastructure, to build the physical economy. You didn't have a British system of just free trade and looting and stealing and claiming it's all controlled by an invisible hand. This was the British Empire policy of looting, where they would go into countries and just destroy them. They did this in India. They tried to do this in the United States, and there was a revolution against that. The problem is the American system, as it was developed by Hamilton, was seen as a deadly threat. And there were many times in our history where we didn't live up to our own system. But the concept was that you couldn't just have political freedom, in words. You had to carry out an economic policy of development. And as I said, this policy prevailed under Lincoln, who used the greenbacks as credit, as Hamilton used the National Bank as credit to build things. In Lincoln's case, he built the Transcontinental Railroad. And this idea that the government could build railroads and infrastructure and development corridors, this actually is the sort of precursor of today's Belt and Road Initiative of China, which is modeled very similarly on this economic theory, which was widely known in the 19th century, by the way. Henry Carey, a leading economist, who was the leading economist and advisor to Lincoln, said there are two systems before the world. This is 1853. The American system, which promotes development and raises the standard of living of man worldwide, including Africa, versus the British system, which degrades people to slaves and destroys their economy and promotes war. Well, the British tried to destroy this system with the Civil War, and Lincoln defeated them, but they were behind the Confederacy in the United States. And after the Civil War, this system, even though it was not perfectly carried out after Lincoln's death, was copied in different ways in Russia with the Trans-Siberian Railroad, in Germany, where Bismarck picked up on government credit for infrastructure and development and replaced the British free trade system. So you had Germany, you had Russia, you had certain circles in France who wanted to build this policy. And this was seen as the threat. Japan began to imitate this type of government credit for industrial development. So the British came up with this theory that Mackinder represented, that somehow we had to play everyone against each other, and there was this magical idea of controlling the Heartland and the rim countries. It was basically a policy for pitting everyone against each other in war, Russia against, it was a justification, so-called based on geography, which was really based on the principle that the British Empire had to play Germany against Russia in order to keep control of the world. It also meant you had to stop the development of what they called the Heartland. You could never let the interior of Eurasia be developed. You had to control the maritime corridors. You had to control all the choke points. So it was a cover story for the British Empire controlling the world.
So the Heartland theory, what is the Heartland? If you can geographically describe to people what Heartland represents, and how it led to Second World War and the aftermath.
Well, I just want to make clear, I don't think it was a theory per se that led to World War I and then World War II. It was a conscious policy. They used the theory to try to justify it, but they created this mythology that somehow and it really is a mythology, because there's nothing inherent about the Heartland that would require one to have a war policy. The theory of Mackinder was that for a small empire, well, not small. I mean, the British had massive control of the world, but for a small country, as in England, to somehow control the world, they had to play everyone against each other, and the idea was to prevent the interior development of Eurasia, meaning Central Europe had to be controlled. You had to prevent an alliance of the so-called Rim countries, meaning Russia could not work with Germany, which was the industrial powerhouse at the time. You had to keep the Japan and Russia at odds against each other, and you had to prevent the United States, from collaborating with these continental powers against the British Empire. So they created a mythology that somehow was necessary to control the heartland of Eurasia. I mean, this what they meant was if we can control the heartland of Central Europe and into Russia, then we control the world. They call it the world island. Now, a lot of this was frankly mumbo jumbo because there's no inherent reason why rim countries have to somehow control. This idea of control which is known as geopolitics, is unfortunately taught as statesmanship, statecraft, to the people who run our State Department. This is what they go to college in. This is considered sanity. I think it's insane. The idea that you would play Germany and Japan and Russia all against each other in order to control the world. The other aspect of this heartland issue is that if you look at a map of Europe, Asia, and then Africa, the vast areas are not supposed to be connected. That's part of this heartland thing, which is prevent the interior development, but control the raw materials. You steal those, but control the shipping, control the trade by controlling the sea lanes. And that was the British specialty, which is they had the British Navy. So they did not want the development of rail and corridors that would connect the vast interior of what they call the heartland, meaning connecting Russia and Asia into Europe and then into Africa. They did not want these types of development corridors, which was, as I said, if you applied the principle that Lincoln had with the Transcontinental Railroad, government promotion of rail corridors allow for the interior development of most of the landmass. They don't want that. So that is what this theory was designed to prevent, is to prevent the construction of these rail corridors, which today you see in the form of the Belt and Road, which China is building. That's precisely the opposite of what Mackinder was trying. It's what he was trying to prevent.
Before we start talking about that, if you can talk about, you and I talked about Franklin Delano Roosevelt,
Very good.
how he did not want that to happen, how he actually envisioned the kind of ideals that the BRICS are embracing right now, and
Exactly.
how the British managed to overturn that. I think if you can tell that story, that would be interesting.
Absolutely. No, it's a story that most people don't know because they look at America today and they assume that America, was always this imperial power. But of course, if people reflect, that's not how people thought about Franklin Roosevelt at the time or how they thought about John F. Kennedy. But Roosevelt, I should just say, just as a little background, he was a follower of Hamilton. His one of his relatives was actually Isaac Roosevelt, was an associate of Hamilton during the American Revolution. And of course, the Roosevelt family, like a lot of families, they were a mixed bag. You had some that were tied to the British Tory faction. They wanted to be part of Wall Street. Roosevelt identified with the part of his family that worked with Hamilton. And Hamilton had the idea you use credit for development, not for control. So Roosevelt was a follower of this idea of using credit, like Lincoln did during the Civil War. And he used that principle in the New Deal of the United States by setting up a credit institution which lent money to build dams, what we call infrastructure today, massive water projects, electrical grids, precisely the kind of thing that you need to carry out in Africa. Now, during the war, which he saw as necessary to ally with the British temporarily, he made it very clear, as his son Elliot Roosevelt said in a book, As He Saw It, that after the war, he said this explicitly, as quoted by Elliot Roosevelt in this book, at many of these wartime conferences with Winston Churchill. He said, Winston, we have a little disagreement here, which is we've got to replace British 18th century methods with American methods of development. And we are going to develop Africa. You cannot take raw materials out of a country and not return the ability to produce in that country. You've got to give these people clean water, infrastructure, sanitation, education. And that's what he identified as the American system. So this was what clearly Roosevelt had in mind when he set up
I
the
think it's
IMF.
really, I think it's really interesting because the infrastructure that this country has was most of it was established right after that. As a result, coming out of the depression, the this country went in a massive building campaign and ended up building the infrastructures that we see all over today that are decaying. And so, World War II, as it ended, you and I talked about how the British had a different agenda, and not to see that happen. So they ended up waiting for Roosevelt to die because he had polio, and they knew that he didn't have a long life, and so they decided to wait it out until Truman came. And if he can tell that story, tie up from what I just left it.
Absolutely, you've got it perfectly. I mean, they knew that Roosevelt had a limited lifespan, and that if you look at how they ran World War II, some people thought it was just incompetence on the part of certain British generals, but they were very consciously prolonging the war because they were afraid if it ended while Roosevelt was still alive, that he would determine what the post-war order was going to be. And in fact, all the institutions Roosevelt set up in 1944 at Bretton Woods directly took away the power of the British to control the world economy. He insisted on a fixed exchange rate. The original idea of Bretton Woods was not what it became. It was to have stable currencies, not just to have the dollar run the world. The idea was to use the dollar as a reserve currency so we could actually develop the world economy, because he wanted to export machinery and technology, I think, like we did with the Marshall Plan to Europe. He wanted to actually do that worldwide, including in Africa. So therefore, he wanted to apply the New Deal that you referred to, building infrastructure, to the whole world, which is why he set up the IMF, he set up the World Bank. This was designed to become something it later was the opposite of, because later it became totally opposite to what Roosevelt had in mind. It didn't develop countries. It simply made loans to keep control, financial control. So as soon as Roosevelt died and Truman came in there, this entire plan was ripped up and replaced with the Cold War, which was not the intention of Roosevelt. He thought, despite the problems with Stalin, the Russians needed to rebuild their economy, and we could work with Stalin and work with China to launch a new economic order for the world. Now, the first thing the British did was they got the United States to drop the atomic bomb on Japan, which then was to send a signal to the Russians, who had been our allies in the war, that, hey, you better watch out or we could do this to you. It was simply a way to terrorize the world, that we're now running the world. And therefore, the world changed completely once Roosevelt died and Truman took over, because then the people who had opposed Roosevelt, these were people tied to Wall Street, they took over the administration. And they launched a witch hunt in America in the name of fighting communism against anybody who was trying to revive the Roosevelt idea. They called them communists.
That is really fascinating. How was the Schiller Institute formed, and what are its goals, or what is it trying to achieve?
Well, the Schiller Institute was actually formed under the principle that we had to declare independence like we did from the British Empire. We had to declare independence from the IMF and the world financial system that we saw at the times that it was founded in 19, I guess it was 80, 83, 84. Prior to the Schiller Institute, Helga LaRouche and her husband Lyndon LaRouche had been organizing the non-aligned movement in the 1970s. Mr. LaRouche came up with an idea that we needed to replace the IMF with an international development bank. And we fought for a year to get this idea out to all the non-aligned nations, which ultimately adopted this principle at their 1976 Colombo, Sri Lanka conference, where they called for a reform of the international financial system. And many of the people involved in that we were collaborating with, like Fred Wills, who was the foreign minister of Guyana. He spoke at the UN in 1976 on behalf of the non-aligned movement, saying that we had to reform the international financial system. And we specifically called for a debt moratorium because all of these debts were manipulated after the dollar was, taken off the gold reserve standard of Bretton Woods. It became this floating exchange rate. You could then manipulate currencies at will and bankrupt
This happened in
countries.
1971, right? This
Exactly.
happened in
And then it was in 1971 that Lyndon LaRouche actually became famous because he forecast this decision of Nixon's would lead to global war, economic collapse, depression, and fascism. And here we are, 50 years later. But the Schiller Institute was specifically formed after the non-aligned movement came out with this decision. They actually called for this. And Mr. LaRouche personally met with Mrs. Indira Gandhi of India, who was one of the leaders of the non-aligned movement. We were talking to leaders all over the world. He met with Lopez Portillo of Mexico, who actually in 1981, after he met with Mr. LaRouche, he had to nationalize the banks because the banking system internationally was trying to take all the money out of Mexico and bankrupt it. So the Schiller Institute was founded to put together a movement worldwide that would declare independence from this financial system, this predatory, colonial, imperial system, as the same way we declared independence from the British Empire. And we took the exact same principles. In fact, when we founded the Schiller Institute, we had people from all over the world there coming in with their flags. And the declaration we wrote was precisely modeled. It was almost word for word with the Declaration of Independence. We just changed the British Empire to the international financial system. So that was the idea, that we had to create a new just economic order. And on that basis, the idea was you could cooperate with countries. You would then have the Soviet system, so we had a little different problem then. But the idea that the Schiller Institute had is we could collaborate with the Soviets, even despite the Cold War, if we could get economic cooperation. And I should just tell you that at this time, Mr. LaRouche had promoted a policy. This is why one of the reasons he was actually put in prison, by the way, shortly thereafter, 5 years later, 1989.
It was when 1980,
89. Lyndon LaRouche.
But you guys started in 1981, 82, 83, 84. This was during the Reagan era.
Yes.
And you were, what was the reception like? Thanks
for you asked. I mean, look, Reagan did not have a clear idea of this economic reform. That's true. But he was open to some of the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche. And we actually tried to bring in a new economic order through the question of defense. Because at the time, as you know, there was a standoff between the U.S. and Russia and Europe with missiles, right at each other's, throat, a few minutes away. We had missiles right on the border in Germany, and Russia had their missiles in Eastern Europe. So what LaRouche proposed, Reagan actually adopted. This was the one issue he did adopt, which was the media called this Star Wars, as you know. LaRouche's idea was that if we could build a laser defense system that would counter nuclear missiles, because they could hit missiles at the speed of light, and we knew the Russians were working on this. So what we proposed is, why don't we jointly work on them together and then end the Cold War and use the technology from the research, and the idea was a craft science program would drive the economy forward, and let us work together. He proposed this to the Russians to build up the underdeveloped nations of Africa and Asia as our joint mission. Now, I have to tell you that I'm not sure that Reagan, I know he didn't fully understand this, but he did endorse this idea and did offer it to the Russians that we jointly develop this. And what we were trying to do was, by ending this Cold War, then begin to shift the US to a new economic order. Now, there were some people who got wind of what LaRouche was proposing, and this included Henry Kissinger. And as soon as he found out that LaRouche was talking to people in the Reagan administration, and Reagan had authorized LaRouche to talk to the Russians about this issue for a year, Henry Kissinger contacted the FBI and demanded that LaRouche immediately be investigated as a Russian agent. And they launched this campaign that went on for years between the international financial cartels. The very people we were attacking launched a campaign to defame LaRouche as a conspiracy theorist, a crackpot. But at the same time, they were complaining that there were people talking to us in the government. So obviously, there was fear about the influence of Lyndon LaRouche. At the same time, they were saying, these guys are crazy and they're insignificant, but they spent millions of dollars to try to attack LaRouche and throw him in prison.
You persisted. You are here today, campaigning. You're campaigning. What are your campaigns like, and what are you trying to achieve? I mean, you have a global campaign that tries to reach out to a lot of different people, countries, and organizations and what have you. And tell us what that campaign is all about. What your goals are, what you're trying to achieve, what your objectives are, your core thought process, so people understand. I think it is very complementary to what is happening, especially to what was happening today, with the BRICS nations coming together in ways that defied the Bretton Woods World Order that it started in 1945. And so, if you can talk about it, it would be great.
Sure, absolutely. In fact, we think the BRICS could continue what Bretton Woods was intended by Roosevelt, but never became. Because what the BRICS are promoting is the industrial and economic development of Africa, Asia, and South America, all the countries that are supposed to be the colonial, the colonies of the financial powers that be. So we see the BRICS as continuing and realizing precisely the ideas the Schiller Institute has been promoting for the last 50 years. It promises to end the era of colonialism that has been going on for 600 years, and actually realize the full potential of what the American Revolution was intended but never realized. What our revolution against empire, and the American Revolution was the first successful anti-colonial revolution in the world. We want America to live up to that and join with the BRICS. So what we're calling for, and we've put this out in a worldwide petition that was just written by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. As the BRICS meeting began on Tuesday, we put out this global appeal to the global north, Europe, America, Japan, South Korea, what's called the global north or the West, that you should join with the BRICS. This is an opportunity, not just of a lifetime, but of the, you don't get this type of opportunity, any more than every few hundred, maybe 500-600 years. And we're right now in the greatest moment of history to get rid of the era of colonialism in the same way that we saw feudalism ending and the modern nation state beginning. This would be the next phase of human history. So we're calling for the West or the global North to collaborate with the BRICS, because it's the only way we're going to rebuild, number one, the economies of the West, which are collapsing, because if we collaborate as Roosevelt intended, we'd have to rebuild the economies of the United States and Europe to export technology and build up infrastructure. So instead of stealing raw materials, we would help nations develop, including our own. Number two, this is the key to stopping nuclear war, because the purpose of these wars, going back, really to the end of the Cold War, go back to, 1990, all of the wars since then have been to impose an imperial world order that is now collapsing. So if we're going to stop a war with Russia and China, it's our view, you have to collaborate economically with the BRICS, which of course include Russia and China. And now you've expanded the BRICS to other countries, and there are a whole bunch of other nations that are going to be working with the BRICS. That means we're talking about the US joining with the majority of the world for a new, just economic order. And that's what we've been fighting for. That's exactly what we've been fighting for the last 50 years.
We are talking to Gerald Belsky from the Schiller Institute. We're talking about BRICS, a little bit of history, American history, how the Schiller Institute wants to work with the rest of the world by cooperating and collaborating with the BRICS nations. And this is a little bit out of the box thinking for Americans. It's probably a very strange idea. It's an idea that does not resonate with many people because a lot of people see the Russians and the Chinese as an existential threat or adversaries at least. And so for the Schiller Institute to come up with this kind of an idea, to think about a world of cooperation and collaboration, economic partnership, integration is extremely unique, something that needs to be supported by everybody. And this is Nafasit posts.com. Make sure to support it. And also, we have a podcast that we just started. It's called Geopolitically Speaking. We are going to talk about matters of importance. The world is changing in ways that we did not anticipate, or we anticipated, but we didn't, you know, think that it was going to happen in the manner that it is happening right now in such a speedy manner. I think a lot of it was aided by the Biden administration's poor approach to global geopolitical events that they unearthed or created or pushed for. The Obama administration before that, the Clinton administration, and the Bush administrations before that. And so this is a breath of fresh air for the world, for to see Americans thinking in terms of cooperation and collaboration. So the Schiller Institute needs to be supported a great deal, and that's the reason why we are communicating with them and collaborating with them, attending seminars, looking for ways to promote the idea of global cooperation. And so I am really grateful for Mr. Belsky for coming and trying to give an input as to what's going on. Can you talk a little bit about the BRICS and what's what you see happening in South Africa? How you can express that?
Well, I would like to just first of all say that we're opening up a dialogue with the BRICS, and we're going to have a conference ourselves, and I invite all your viewers, you can go to the Schiller Institute, you'll see this, on September the 9th. We're going to have an online conference, and we're inviting people from the BRICS, as well as countries that are associated with the BRICS, but the global majority, you could say, to have a dialogue about how we're going to make this happen. And therefore, we have to create a coalition in the United States for this policy. I think there's tremendous resonance in the BRICS to what we're saying. If you look at the optimism and the desire for the future, for development in South Africa, in even with countries that there's all sorts of problems and poverty and lack of development, there's a sense that there's a future out there, and we have to be part of that. So yes, we're talking to people in South Africa, in other parts of Africa, in South America. We're pulling people into an alliance with us. I think these developments are going to are massively revolutionary. The fact that you just had added to the BRICS Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and other Algeria, and Argentina is extremely important because all these countries are targeted to be cut off of credit. They're targeted for internal destabilization, for chaos, etc. This has to end. And therefore, the best way to end them is for people in America to realize that the aspirations of the BRICS are something that we should aspire to, because we have similar problems in the United States. If you look at the state of our collapsing infrastructure, because what we built in the 1930s has collapsed. We've got to revive it. We've got to rebuild it. So therefore, yes, we see tremendous opportunity. Now, the specific role of the Schiller Institute and our movement has been to show how can you create the credit. This was Mr. LaRouche's specialty. How can you create credit when you have different countries, different currencies, different cultures? We don't want to have something like the EU, where you create one, a currency that is going to determine and is controlled by bureaucrats over each country. No, we want national sovereignty. So we have to have a dialogue and discussion. You can't just impose these ideas. On the other hand, you have to have countries able to trade among themselves without the dollar controlling things. So creates a real, there's no simple answer to how you do this. But what Mr. LaRouche proposed is a new metric. And this is our specific contribution to the BRICS. One, a dialogue of cultures among different countries where, despite different cultures, there's one idea of human creativity, which you will find in all cultures. Number two, Mr. LaRouche proposed that instead of the metric being money as the criteria for an economy, it should be what can you physically produce to maintain what he called the potential population relative density. That is, how many people can you support given your level of technology? Not how many people can you get rid of and how many resources can you steal, which is the criteria, it seems to be, of the IMF system, but rather, how can we increase population potential? That doesn't mean you're going to have exactly that number of people, but if you can create new breakthroughs in science, which come from the human mind, which means you have to produce the physical goods to raise families, you have to educate people to advance science, which means they have to have infrastructure and living standards capable of doing that. You're talking about a revolution in the world economy. That's exactly what this financial system does not want. It's not just a question of money. They don't want people to think that way, so therefore an elite cannot control the world as their own little feudal, empire. So we're going to be in a dialogue with many of the BRICS countries, but I would invite people to go to our conference on September the 9th, and we hope to have representatives of the BRICS, of Russia, China, Africa, South America, Asia, people we're working with all over the world in a discussion about how to make this happen.
So how do you think the BRICS, I would say successful summit
Yes.
that incorporated a lot of countries that participated in it, that created an aura of hope for the world, a new world order, for lack of a better term.
Yes.
How do you think that is being perceived in Washington and in Great Britain?
I would say they're trying to figure out how to stop it and try to destroy it. On the other hand, it is reality. So therefore, we're appealing to anyone who's realistic, who is not living in a fantasy world. You have to face the fact this is the new reality of the world. The BRICS are not going to disappear. The only way that circles in London or Wall Street or Washington could stop this process would be if they launch World War III. So therefore, they're going to try to stop this. There's going to be destabilizations. There's going to be all sorts of games. We know the British are already, there's already articles about them, trying to send assassination squads into Africa, believe it or not. They're trying to train Ukrainians now to go into Africa. This was one story about MI6. And I'm not completely sure if that's accurate, but it sounds plausible to me. What they don't want to see is these development projects. So how do we counter these games? we have to get people in the United States who are not crazy, who've gone along with this, but are not crazy, to say, look, let's sit down and negotiate an end to these wars, and therefore let's also negotiate a new economic order, because our financial system is bankrupt. We've been insisting you cannot bail it out. Look at the last, 15 years since 2008. The bailouts failed. Now they're raising interest rates. They're collapsing the banking system. We've insisted that in order to collaborate with the BRICS, you would have to have a financial reform of the West. We're talking about Glass-Steagall being the first step, where you separate banks, as Roosevelt did, by the way, in the 1930s, set up FDIC banking insurance, not to insure the gambling. Therefore, the speculative banks, the investment banks, were not covered under Glass-Steagall. That was changed. So therefore, you have to insure banks, but you have to issue new credit, as Hamilton did, as Roosevelt did. So you combine restructuring the banks, bankruptcy reorganization, write off a lot of these worthless debts, but put new credit into building up the real physical economy, as the BRICS want to do, and you'll rebuild the Western economies at the same time. Now, that's obviously what people in London and Wall Street don't want, but anybody who's sane has got to accept that.
I think one of the things that really amazes me is when they formed the system that we have today, that they took advantage of for the last 80 years after World War II. They want to continue it by any means necessary. Don't you
Right.
think? Don't you think, or you would think that they would be concerned about repercussions if they are going to send their assassins to Africa, the Middle East, and everywhere else? Don't you think the repercussions are going to be much greater because there is a balance of power? Not very many people are scared. The arms are kind of balanced unless you want to use nuclear power. What you can do in Africa could be done in Great Britain, regardless of how secure you feel you are. And I think, especially now that the world is, gunning for you, like what's happening in Niger against France and other places. And so, how do you think? What is the thinking process behind it?
It's an attempt to maintain an empire that's dead. So therefore, it doesn't work. But it's. I don't think the way to defeat this is fight them the same way they want to fight you. You've got to outflank them by appealing to people in the West who are not. See, I don't think people um, necessarily are going to oppose the BRICS when they realize, hey, wait a minute, they're doing what this country was founded to do in making a revolution against the British Empire. Why don't we live up to our own Constitution and to the ideas of Franklin Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, who attempted in his own way to revive these principles, Abraham Lincoln, and Alexander Hamilton, and there are others. But that's the idea that LaRouche has always had. We got to awaken people in the West. What we're doing, as you pointed out, will not work. You're not going to stop this process. Therefore, if you're trying to stop it militarily against Russia and China, then you're going to nuclear war. So one thing we've done is the Schiller Institute has initiated an international peace coalition to rally all forces that want to stop this idea of global war, whatever their other differences. But our specific view and our specific contribution to this peace coalition is to insist that if you want to stop war, you have to have economic development. You have to have economic justice. And that goes together with establishing a durable peace. Otherwise, you're always at war to try to stop this. So, yes, the people we're fighting are going to try to sabotage it. The question is, how many people in the West, how many realistic forces, even within the financial world and the political world, are going to face reality? The BRICS is the new thing. Why would you oppose a model, which the BRICS are using, of how China got 800 million people out of poverty? That method works. Why would we want to prevent it? We should, in fact, copy it. It's what the U.S. used to do in this American system I was referring to. So, therefore, our main campaign now is to win support in the West to work with the BRICS for a new economic order based on justice.
What I am not certain about is you see the people in the West, they are so not into the kind of thinking that the Schiller Institute is pushing forward. And, a lot of people are into entertainment, uh, debt strapped, uh, very confused, not aware of what's happening in the world. And so, this ideas that you're talking about are very foreign to the Western world, that are completely not into the world at all. They have absolutely no idea what's going on. They don't know what the BRICS are, except for very few. Uh, they don't have the awareness, because they have deliberately been misled by the mainstream or the Western media that is deliberately misleading
Right.
people. How do you overcome that?
Well, it's the way that what you're describing is a form of social control, very similar to the Roman Empire, right? How do you lead it? You have to have an organized force of people who understand that there is a way to change this. And you have to inspire people the way that Martin Luther King inspired people in the civil rights movement, the way Mahatma Gandhi inspired people to overthrow the British Empire. You have to have a higher idea that appeals to people's humanity, because everything you described is a way to control people and keep them small-minded, pessimistic, and defeated. A defeated people is not going to overthrow a system that's evil. So you have to get people to realize there is something good in America we could revive, which is the American Revolution idea and the ideas that I've talked about in terms of the American system. But there is a new order emerging. And the way I would say, I would answer your question is that we have to build a force. It may be a minority, but an organized force that knows what to do and is showing people that what is going on with the BRICS is the coming world order. Now, why could we do this? Because the system in the West is collapsing. It's bankrupt. If you look at how the Soviet system and the East Bloc system fell, it was preceded by an economic breakdown that was really underwent, caused profound changes in people. But there were people in the East Bloc who finally said, we have to, get rid of the Berlin Wall. And this was precipitated by the fact that the East Bloc economy was collapsing. And our Western economy is collapsing even more. People cannot survive if they cling to simply trying to survive, because they're not going to survive unless we change the system. Now, the BRICS have given us a way out. So what we have to do, and it might take a miracle to make it might look like a miracle, but that's how history changes. You don't continue doing the same thing. Remember what Einstein said about trying to do the same thing. It's a form of insanity, thinking you're going to get a different result. So therefore, we have to the only way we're going to get a new result is we've got to get people to use their creative capabilities, given to them by God, their creative capacity to realize, which means we have to have a movement that inspires them to realize there is a better future. So that's what we're going to discuss at the Schiller Institute conference on September the 9th, how to overturn this system which the BRICS are opposing.
Of course, based on what I have heard you say and all the things that you are doing, you're focusing on creating awareness within the African diaspora community, and also you want to reach out to Africans all over around the world, to explain to them what the Schiller Institute is all about. I think it is a bridge. I think it's a bridge like we've never seen before, and so if I would like you to talk about what you're doing and how people can get involved in
Absolutely.
supporting what you're doing.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. We are reaching out, as I reached out to you and other groups who are the African diaspora, but we're doing the same thing with other organizations. I think the Africans are extremely important in not just freeing Africa, but helping us free the West, because what Africans want in terms of ending colonialism, ending the destruction of their countries, ending the destruction of living standards, resources. That should be the attitude in America. So we actually need people from Africa and African descent in America to help us wake up other Americans that they should want the same thing. Now, we're also reaching out to other ethnic Americans who come from different countries, who obviously are the most in tune with what the BRICS are doing, because they know what's going on in the country they're from, and they know that there's, over 150 countries that want to work with the Belt and Road. So therefore, if you can get all of these ethnic groups in America to wake up other Americans, we can help swing the West into an alliance with the BRICS. So that's what we're trying to do.
If you have any questions for Mr. Belsky, you can send it on the chat. Just make sure to follow, like, and comment. So this becomes a collaborative, engagement for all Africans to help affect the change that is taking place. I think what is happening now is probably one of the most historic transformation in world geopolitical developments. It is transformative, and for the first time in our history, I believe, we see a way to create a balance whereby countries can exchange based on their interests and based on their relationships, based on a lot of different things. And so, the kind of approach that's taking place. For example, the Russians and the Chinese coming to the Horn of Africa, bringing Ethiopia as a member of the BRICS, and they have to safeguard the interests of Ethiopia. When they do safeguard the interests of Ethiopia, when the Ethiopian economy develops, the spin-off effect is going to be tremendous. And you have a population growth that is taking place. For example, in the Horn of Africa, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan, Egypt, Uganda, South Sudan, Mali, Chad, Central African Republic, going all the way down to Niger. All these countries, they have a population of over 500 million people. If you industrialize that area, you're talking about a new economic front, and I think this is what the BRICS are all about. This is
Exactly.
the kind of stuff that we need to promote and to create awareness about, so people can focus on the opportunities that are upcoming and try to start to work towards those opportunities. And this is actually a great opportunity for for Western countries that have been pillaging and taking advantage of it wrongly. Now they have an opportunity to do it the right way by partnering with Africans. And
Exactly.
I think the educational aspect of it is going to be very, very important. And that's the reason why I do believe your approach is the right approach. And I would like to preach that and let people know as much as I can about what
Great.
it is that you're doing. And, I would love for you to talk about the events that are coming up so people can start taking part in what you're doing.
Okay. Let me just say that unfortunately, for time reasons, I'm going to have to leave pretty soon. But I want to invite people to the Schiller Institute conference on September the 9th, which is going to be open to everybody to watch. It'll be on YouTube. Just go to the Schiller Institute. You can register and we'll send you updates on it. But just go to the schillerinstitute.com, SCHILLER.com, and you will see the invitation to this conference. We're lining up speakers from all over the world. And frankly, we want to get Americans to realize that if people in Ethiopia, Niger, and other places can actually, stand up to this empire, then why can't people in the United States who have less of an excuse to stand up and say, we're tired of being slaves to this thing? Because the same financial empire that has destroyed Africa, which Africans are now standing up and saying we've had enough of, we think Americans should have the same attitude, frankly. If you look at America, we should be changing this country back to, something a little more positive, as Roosevelt intended. So therefore, it's really a sort of an attitude, a statement of mind. Are we going to be pessimistic and say we can't change anything? Or are we going to say, hey, look, if the BRICS can have this attitude, why can't we? They're looking to the future. And yes, you're absolutely correct. This is an opportunity to develop the world. In fact, Africa should be the next China in terms of the development of the world economy. And you can extend this into South America and into the rest of Asia. So the world is changing. Now, is this simple? No. The enemy we're dealing with is going to try to stop this, confuse people. Yes. But we have to educate people. This is the way out for the United States because there is no other solution. That's the advantage we have. There is no other solution. And certainly blowing up the world is not going to be the solution. So they can kick and scream, like Rumpelstiltskin and scream, we have to keep our power. We can't give up. Well, that's insanity. So therefore, we got to get people to realize there is a way out. So that's going to be our next event, September the 9th. On the 21st, we're planning another demonstration at the United Nations. We had our Peace Coalition had one on Hiroshima Day. We're planning one on World Peace Day. And we want to pull, when the UN session comes in, which the BRICS issue is going to be discussed, at that session, we would like to have Americans there at the UN, and we want to get a dialogue with all these nations that we want to join forces with the BRICS, not for global war, because the war is designed to stop us.
I think.
But Emmanuel, unfortunately, I'm going to have to be leaving soon. I'd like to continue this dialogue with you on some other occasion, perhaps, and we certainly want to work with you. And I appreciate everything you have said about what we're doing.
Well, I do appreciate you coming and really explaining the Schiller Institute, the history. I love talking with you and the history aspect of it, and I'm very grateful, and definitely will continue having this conversation. And thank you
Great.
very much.
And maybe you can teach me something about the history of Eritrea. I'll have to look
I
at the
have a
book.
book on it, the history of the U.S. and Eritrea. I did write a book about it, and I
Great.
think it's really fascinating. That's the reason why I can talk to you about some of the stories that you
Great,
raised.
excellent, very good. Well, thank you very much. It was very good talking to you, Emmanuel. Thank
Good
you.
talking to you. Have a good
Thank
night.
You too.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye bye. Well, we just talked with Mr. Joe, and it was really a very, very insightful conversation. And I know I've been gone for the last 2 months or 3 months. I was working on a project and, taking some classes for my personal career, just revamping some things. And I am ready. I've been ready. We have a podcast coming up. It's called Geopolitically Speaking, and we are going to talk about a lot of different issues. I have been working on creating partnership with a lot of different groups, as you just saw with the Schiller Institute. We communicate. There are people like Mike Sium, Mardoka, and others. We communicate, do outreach programs as part of the public diplomacy campaign with the Eritrean community here. Your support is extremely important. The reason why it's important is because we have been under attack for a long time, and our campaigns have been fighting the enemy. And I think you see that we have achieved tremendous success in terms of winning against the TPLF and its handlers. And now we are at a point where you see President Isaias traveling everywhere, going to China, going to Russia, to Egypt, and now South Africa, with a mission, and that is to transform the region. And I think we have done an amazing job as Eritreans to really position ourselves in a way that is going to elevate the lives of the people of Eritrea for generations to come. Our sacrifices were based on a number of things, but mainly because we paid heavily in terms of the struggle, the amount of people that we paid in order to get independence. We are indebted to them. And one of the most amazing things about Eritrea is the fact that we are true to our martyrs. We have been very true to our martyrs, and to get to the point that we are today, after what we went through, what Eritrea went through over the last 25 years with the TPLF and its handlers, is what a lot of countries were not able to, uh, you know, to resist. They could not survive it. We've seen that in Libya. We've seen that in Syria. We've seen that in Iraq. A lot of other African countries, Somalia. These were countries that were formed way before Eritrea became independent, and they were considered countries. But the people of Eritrea have been able to withstand, and now we are in a position to really have the kind of life that we aspire to have. The region is transforming in ways that I believe will want us to move back to Africa, to Eritrea, to the region, to be a part of the upcoming development, because I don't think there's anything that's going to stop what's coming in Saudi Arabia and Egypt and hopefully Sudan and Eritrea and hopefully Ethiopia, and but just overall what's taking place in Africa, what's taking place around the world is very transformative, and I think we can take advantage of it. But in order to do that, we have to follow what is happening in Eritrea. What Eritrea is doing, we need to be able to replicate in the uh, abroad. Eritrean communities were really fighting, like I said earlier, to survive. And now that we overcame all that, we are on a new stage of rebuilding our communities. We are going to be on a stage of recovery. We are going to be on a stage of rehabilitating the things that we need to rehabilitate. And so I urge people to support what I'm doing to elevate our media, our presence, not only here but across Africa and the world, because we are capable to do that. And for right now, that's what I want to say. And but I'm going to come back and do a lot of programs, even in Tigrinya, to talk about some of the geopolitical developments in this program. And so make sure to go to Nafasi Post, subscribe, donate, support it, because it's imperative that you do. And also, I have a link in bio that combines all my work and puts it together. I'm going to put it on the website. I'm going to put it on the YouTube channel, on all my social media platforms. And so everything that's there, support it. And I will talk about my book at some point. There are some complications with it that are happening because of the TPLF and its agents, what they're trying to do. I'm not ready to talk about it right now because there are some legal impediments to that. But I want to be able to write books. There are books that I have almost completed or in completion or whatever, and I want to be able to share it with people. But they are attacking everything Eritrea. They want to make sure that we don't tell the true story. And so my book, The History of the U.S. and Eritrea, has gotten a lot of resistance from. They have blocked different ways. And so I would like you to keep engaging with me. I would like you to keep uh, following everything that we are doing so we could do it at the highest of levels. With that, you have a wonderful night. Make sure to follow everything I'm doing. I think I'm going to play Yemane Baria for to say goodnight. One of my favorite songs. Or maybe what Tuhut. I found. Bye bye.